Inscribed inside the casing of every Macintosh, unseen by the consumer, are the signatures of the whole team. This is Apple's way of affirming that their latest innovation is a product of the individuals who created it, not the corporation.
So there's this story about the early development of the iPhone and the creation of iOS, or iPhone OS at the time, and what it took to get to the point where the iPhone was developed based off of the iteration of the macOS software at the time that Steve Jobs had brought over from his time away from Apple when he had created Next. And the story basically goes like this. Apple decides that it's going to make a phone. There are two competing projects at the time. One to make a new phone operating software based off of the iPod's OS. And the other one is an attempt to shrink down Mac OS to work on a phone. It's told in many ways, but the gist of the actual story basically goes like this. Two competing projects working on a prototype for a device. Really simple. The iPod software is starting from square one. It's trying to bake everything up from the things they'd made on the iPod, which was relatively unsophisticated compared to macOS at the time. On the other side of things, the people working on macOS were trying to shrink that down. Steve knew at the time that he wanted to make the iPhone, and he knew he wanted to launch it as soon as possible. And so, with a tight timetable, you had to make a bet. Which one would be the horse that you'd back? Because you didn't want to split your attention, right? Focus is about saying no. So you had to choose one or the other. Are you going to go the iPod route, or are you going to go the macOS route? And apparently, after a couple months of tinkering, Steve decided that, well, the right decision was to go take the macOS operating system and then shrink it down to the size of a phone. And it seems like a really obvious decision looking backwards, but Steve's intuition there is the piece of the puzzle that I think is missing from our conversation yesterday about the way that directors and the film production, the process of film production is related or can describe product development and innovation in any collaborative effort. And I think that this story begins to poke holes in that analogy, and it shows us where that analogy crumbles. So I really wanted to get into that explanation of why that is.
The greatest people are self-managing. They don't need to be managed. If they know once they know what to do, they'll go figure out how to do it. They don't need to be managed at all. What they need is a common vision. And that's what leadership is. What leadership is having a vision, being able to articulate that so the people around you can understand it, and getting a consensus on a common vision. We wanted people that were insanely great at what they did, but we're not necessarily those seasoned professionals, but who had at the tips of their fingers and in their passion the latest understanding of where technology was and what we could do with that technology. We went through that stage in Apple where we went out and we thought, we're going to be a big company, let's hire professional management. We went out and hired a bunch of professional management. It didn't work at all. Most of them were bozos. They knew how to manage, but they didn't know how to do anything. And so if you're a great person, why do you want to work for somebody you can't learn anything from? And you know what's interesting? You know who the best managers are? They're the great individual contributors who never ever want to be a manager, but decide they have to be a manager because no one else is going to be able to do as good a job as them.
So I think that there's two reasons why Apple is structured the way that it is, and that it is a functionally structured organization rather than a divisionally structured one. Now, there's a long history explaining why the conventional wisdom is that when a company gets big, it has to be divisionally structured, and why startups and smaller companies tend to be functionally structured. The gist of the difference between the two is that a functional organization has the top level executives in charge of the functions of the business. So in Apple's case, this might be hardware, software, sales, marketing, legal, things like that. On the other side of things, in a divisional organization, you might have people who are hired up as general managers, and those general managers are usually in charge of a product or a swath of products. So instead of having people in charge of hardware, software, interface, legal, etc., you might have them in charge of iPhone, iPad, Mac OS, etc. The main reason Jobs structured it this way is because he was a product guy. He let everything flow through him when it came to product decisions, and he was the only one at the time that allowed, that actually even had product decisions flow through him. And he structured it that way because he thought that it was better for innovation to have a functionally structured business than a divisionally structured one. And so that functional organization explains our conversation yesterday about film production. Now, film production with a director at the head is very similar to Jobs in that creative product role, right? A director has an idea of what the end product is. They have a vision for how to tell a story. Jobs had a vision for how to create a product. Directors have these functional units. They have the people in charge of the camera. They have the people in charge of the lighting. They have the people in charge of the set, in charge of the costuming, in charge of the makeup. And these different functional departments allow the director to compose something into compose these talents into something much greater. And the cohesive vision holds it together and allows them to execute on a product. At Apple, same story. You combine hardware, software, interface, sales, marketing, etc. And that allows you to create an end-to-end story for the lifetime and use of a fantastic product. But I think that the director analogy only works in one direction, right? The direction where all of the talent flows up through to the director. Of course, the director then makes decisions and communicates back down via that route. But the reality is that movie productions don't have to operate on the same timelines that technological productions have to operate on. And so there's a fundamental difference between the two. Because in technology, in any business that's built on innovation, you need someone who's able to bet on the right horses. Because there's a million different ways that you can approach some problem, or a million different ways, a million different technologies that you could focus your efforts on. But if focus is about saying no, then you have to choose the right technologies to focus on to use your resources effectively, to get everyone pulling in the same direction. And on top of that, you have to make sure that the technologies that you bet on are ones that are not going to fizzle out. So this brings me back to the iPhone OS story, right? Jobs wisely chose the shrunken Mac OS route to take for the iPhone. And that's because he had it was battle tested. He had those scars. He had the scar tissue from his previous mistakes. And he utilized that in a way that allowed him to, number one, structure Apple for innovation, which was the impetus for functional structure in the first place in his mind. And number two, allow him to be the center of the product. I want to really meditate on why functional organizations allow this for a second. And I want to think about how that applies to Apple Vision Pro and the shuttered Apple Car project, right? So the first thing I want you to think about is a nature metaphor, right? In nature, we talk a lot about this idea of biodiversity, right? A healthy ecosystem is one that is biodiverse. It's got lots of different forms of life at different scales that contribute and have different roles and utilize and exploit different aspects of the environment and the ecosystem to achieve something, which is their own survival, right? So the more biodiverse an ecosystem, the more likely it is to be self-sustaining and survive. I think that this idea of biodiversity applies to innovation, right? This is definitely not a novel concept, but one way of thinking about innovation is that nature is quite innovative, right? These trees out here are able to do what they do. They're able to survive because they've evolved over millennia, millions of years even, right, to get to the point where they exploit the environment effectively. And that's because they take a very different approach than the ducks in the pond, right? They're exploiting different aspects of the environment for their own good and for their own survival. And this sort of cyclical nature of the ecosystem and the environment allows for them all to act in harmony in a broad scale, right? So in some ways, this biodiverse, or a lack of centralization, right? The tree didn't get to decide what the duck does, and the duck doesn't get to decide what the tree does. This lack of centralization for you could call it an intelligence of evolution, right? Allows these different things to have innovative solutions to their own survival, right? And I want us to think about that, right? There's no central decision point in nature, we'll just say for the purposes of this video, right? Where, this thing decides, oh, well, a tree's going to be shaped this way because it achieves this. No, trees evolve themselves to match the requirements of the environment they're in. And so there's no single decision point, and that allows this biodiverse ecosystem to exist because everyone can try a million different things, and we can all pull in different directions and each have our own unique idea. This idea of biodiversity and this idea of centralization versus decentralization explains why many big companies and why why many big companies don't work functionally, and why Apple's approach to a functional organization is unique for the size of their organization. And that is because if there was a person out there designing all of these things, right, they would have to have this almost insane amount of bandwidth in order to know exactly how to design every bit of the system of a tree and every bit of the system of a duck or the pond or the ecosystem, right? It just requires too much. And you can imagine that person designing all of these things being overwhelmed with the number of technological and biological and strategic decisions that they have to make on their own. And so when companies get big, they get to the point where, well, they start to look a little bit more like the environment, like nature, right? Instead of having one person in charge of designing a product from end to end, they move to a system where they let that kind of centralized knowledge be a little more decentralized. They add a profit and loss statement to these general managers and let them kind of be in charge of their own domain. They've got one general manager in charge of the trees, and one in charge of the ducks, and one in charge of the fish in the pond, and one in charge of the algae, right? There's actually this principle about money, too, that explains this, right? So if the defining feature of a divisional organization is that the money goes to where the brains are, right? These general managers are given money. And this applies to this. This is an example of this principle of centrality of money, which is that the more some central authority decides who makes what and who gets what, the less a society or a group or a company needs money. And that's because money is this thing that has a mind of its own. It disperses the ability for people to innovate and delegates that responsibility amongst a broad group of people. The converse is also true. The more decision-making is centralized, the less money needs to be used for that decision-making. This is an authoritarian regime or a democratic, as opposed to a democratic regime, right? Now let's think about Apple. Apple is famously, some would say notoriously, centralized. They're very top-down and very hierarchical, right? Apple is designed to centralize that authority in Steve Jobs. That's why he created it that way, right? He got to decide who made what and who got what. This is just the, actually, let me back up a little bit. The iPod versus Mac OS story for the iPhone explains this perfectly. He was the one who decided. He was the central authority. He was the tiebreaker in the end. yes, there was a little bit of innovation, two separate groups, but ultimately Jobs is the one dictating what would be made and how it would be made. There's this other thing about divisional organizations that I want to talk about, which is that they align accountability and control, right? And the way that they do that is with money, right? And so when accountability and control are aligned, it increases the biodiversity of that environment, but it also makes things less efficient. The environment is really not efficient in the way that it uses resources. I mean, it's kind of beautiful in the long run, what happens here, but it takes a long time for these things to evolve, for these products, right? These trees, these ducks to evolve. And so it takes a lot of time for that innovation to happen, right? And that is why Apple is so efficient about what they do. It's because they have focus and they say no to a lot of things and they do their best to make the bets on the right horses so that way they have the best likelihood for success in the long run. In fact, Microsoft and Intel and IBM and Google, they all outspend Google on research and they all outspend Apple on research and development. And that's because they take this more divisional approach. Google's got 1 million different projects that it starts and then kills because they take the more environmental perspective. You want a diverse group of people trying a diverse group of things, and then you select from the winners and go from there. It hasn't really worked for them for the most part. I mean, they've built businesses, but nothing like Google Search, which was originally something that was around an innovation that a centralized authority decided. So, let me take one more step out before zooming all the way back in. There's also this other principle, and this comes from John Kenneth Galbraith, a famous Harvard economist, right? And he wrote a book called The Affluent Society, where he describes how economies become a different beast when the economy becomes affluent, when it becomes a rich society rather than one that is primarily based off of a need and desire, or not desire, based more off of desire than on need, right? One based off of those desires rather than suffering in some ways, right? And in that book, he says that there's a difference between concentrated big industries, and small, diverse industries. And that is that concentrated industries can afford research and development. Think of Google, think IBM, think Microsoft. They have so much money and so much talent that they can just throw money and throw talent at a problem until it's fixed. That's what research and development is. In smaller industries, that doesn't happen. Think farming. Farming's not the greatest example because the U.S. government does end up subsidizing it, but think farming without the U.S. government, or think, I don't know, restaurants or food delivery or things like that. Like most of those things are smaller industries that are relatively self-contained and don't have a lot of innovation behind them, right? The tech industry now is the perfect vindication of Galbraith's assertion that that's the case many years later, because it's totally true. Almost every company has the ability to spend gobs of money in research and development and just hope that it all works out in the end. They get to be the environment because they are essentially playing God, right? And the question is, which form of innovation is more effective? That form, the environmental, the God-playing one, or the one that is more focused, the Apple way? I want you to remember Jobs' original claim when he came back to Apple, that he had to restructure the company into a functional organization because functional organizations are better set to disrupt than to be disrupted. The reason he thought this is because people who work in technology like to be on the cutting edge. They like to work with people who are specialized in the way that they are. They like to be led by people who know more than them, so that way they can learn from those people who know more from them. And conversely, the other side of that coin is also true, that managers, people who are experts, like to lead other experts, right? Famous Harvard Business Review article said that described, I think it was published in 2020, it described how Apple was organized, and the bottom line on the front page, they said, the difference between Apple and every other company is that experts lead experts, right? And so that is what Jobs thought, that if we want the best talent in the Valley, we've got to have structures so the best talent wants to work here. We don't want somebody working for some general manager who doesn't know what they're doing. I can't learn anything from a general manager. And so on top of all the other issues of running in different directions and doing all these things, the thing about working at Apple is that you work for people who work in the same lane that you do. You play for the same sport with the elite talent on that sport, and you're all pulling in the same direction. The result of that is that experts float the people with the most expertise float their way to the top of Apple's org chart, right? They go all the way to the top, and the people who are best positioned to make guesses about the future of the innovative department that they're in end up with the most decision-making power. And so this gets back to what we talked about yesterday with technological windows. And it also gets back to why the director or the auteur theory doesn't completely explain everything about Apple. So let's tie a bow on it. In order to be successful in creating a product, you can act like a director. You can compose these incredibly talented individual departments, these groups of people, and put them together in a way that makes something greater than the sum of its parts. It makes a beautiful, breakthrough, innovative product. But in order to get that innovation, you need to go beyond what a director does, right? You need to be able to place the right bets early on and have an intuition and the scar tissue and the instinct to know exactly which ones are going to work and which ones aren't. That's how you exploit a technological window, is by using your intuition. Jobs was great at this. And so, this was the failure of the Apple car, right? They bet on the wrong technological horse. And this gets at the weakness of a functional organization, right? If you're saying no to a lot of things, well, sometimes you say no to everything except for the thing that isn't going to work out from a technological perspective. Apple bet the car project on self-driving AI, and that was because basically everyone else in the Valley was working on it. It was kind of this, I think Gruber puts it as FOMO, but on the scale of a tech industry giant with billions of dollars, right? And it just didn't pan out. And so every decision that you work backwards from there, if the core technology that you're building your product around isn't going to work out, then every other decision you make about design, marketing, sales, the surrounding technologies that it require, they don't necessarily go to waste. But you have to throw the baby out with the bathwater because they're so tightly integrated. And because you haven't bet on a bunch of other smaller projects, well, it feels like a huge loss to kill a project like that. And that's the story of the Apple car. That said, Apple Vision Pro was cooked up in the same stew a little after the Apple car, in the same stew of desires for our next product that Apple was going to work on, right? And so there was a little bit of the divisional structure within Apple and their functional organization. And so on the flip side, Apple Vision Pro bet on a core technology, which was augmented reality. And I'll say, Tim Cook has been saying this for years, that augmented reality is a profound technology. And so, whereas he failed with AI and self-driving on the Apple car, he succeeded with AR on the Apple Vision Pro. And so, he placed a couple of bets on a couple of different technological horses, and he lost one and won the other. Now, Whether Apple can take that and run with it is another question entirely. We've discussed it at length on this channel in the past. But the point is that if you make the wrong bet, it can be wasteful in a functional organization. But if you make the right bet, well, you've got focus, and you can roll from there.